After 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. I thought there was nothing left that could stop me cold. Nothing that could make me, Frank Caprio, a man who has sat in this chair through thousands of cases, through tears and anger and lies and desperation, go completely silent. But then one Tuesday morning in November, a young man walked into my courtroom and said 4 words, just 4 words, and I couldn't speak. I couldn't find a single thing to say. I sat there behind my bench with my mouth open and my eyes stinging, and the whole courtroom waiting for me. And I'm going to tell you exactly what those 4 words were, and everything that happened around them, because this story changed me. It reminded me why I put on these robes every single morning. And it reminded me that the most powerful thing you will ever see in a courtroom isn't justice, it's love. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me. You won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence, Rhode Island for 40 years. I got this seat in 1984, and I have never once taken it for granted, not for a single day. Every morning when I button up my shirt and knot my tie, I think about what my father told me when I was a boy growing up in this city. He came here from Italy with nothing. Absolutely nothing. He had a small bag with a change of clothes, a few dollars that were barely worth anything, and a belief that in America a man could build something real if he worked hard enough and treated people with respect. He got a job in a bakery. He worked 6 days a week. He learned English at night school while my mother watched us kids. And he used to sit me down at the kitchen table and say, "Frank, in this country the law is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you came here on a ship with nothing or if your grandfather built half the buildings downtown. When you stand before the law, you stand equal." I was maybe 10 years old when he first said that to me, and I didn't fully understand it then. But I've spent 40 years proving him right. I get to the courthouse every morning at 8:15. I've been doing it since the very first day I took this job, and I have not changed that one bit. I walk in through the side entrance, I say good morning to the security officers, and I make my way back to my chambers. Christina, my clerk, she's been with me for a long time now, and she knows me better than most. She has my coffee waiting on my desk every single morning, strong, black, no sugar. I've had it that way my whole life. My wife used to try to get me to add a little cream, said it would be gentler on my stomach. But some habits just stick with you. I sit down with that coffee and I go through the day's case files. I read every single one. Some judges rush through them. I never do. Because behind every name on that piece of paper, behind every charge and citation number, there is a human being with a story. And I've learned that the story is always more important than the charge. I've been married to my wife for 48 years. She is the most patient woman God ever put on this earth. And she will tell you herself that living with a judge isn't always easy. I bring this job home with me sometimes, not the cases. I've always kept those confidential, but the weight of it, the feeling you carry when you know your decisions affect real people's lives. She's always understood that. She'll look at me across the dinner table sometimes and she'll say, "Frank, what happened today?" And I'll shake my head and say, "I'll tell you after dinner." And she always waits. 48 years. She's always waited. I don't deserve that kind of patience, but I'm grateful for every day of it. My grandson turned 12 last month. Watching him grow up, watching him become curious about the world, asking questions about fairness and right and wrong, it reminds me every single day why this work matters. He asked me once, "Grandpa, what's the most important thing a judge does?" And I told him, I said, "A judge listens. That's the most important thing. Not the rulings, not the gavel, not the robe, the listening." Because if you really listen to people, and I mean really listen, not just with your ears, but with your heart, you start to understand things about the human condition that you cannot learn any other way. He thought about that for a minute, and then he said, "So you're like a really serious therapist." And I laughed. I said something like that, yes. I want to tell you about the morning of that Tuesday in November, because the way the day started matters to the way it ended. I remember it was cold, that particular kind of cold that Providence gets in early November, where the wind comes in off the water and cuts right through your coat. I had parked my car and walked the half block to the courthouse, and by the time I got inside, my hands were stiff. Christina handed me my coffee almost before I had my coat off, and she said, "Good morning, Judge. We have a full docket today, 22 cases." I looked at the stack of files on my desk, and I said, "Then we better get started." I thumbed through the first few files while I drank my coffee. Routine stuff mostly. Parking violations, a couple of speeding tickets, one case involving an expired registration. Nothing that jumped out at me as unusual, but I have learned after 40 years never to assume a day is going to be routine, because it never really is. People surprise you. Life surprises you. And just when you think you've heard every possible version of every possible story, someone walks through those doors and shows you something you've never seen before. I took the bench at 9 o'clock sharp. The courtroom was already pretty full. I always notice the room when I walk in. It's something I've done my whole career. I scan the gallery. I take in the energy of the space. I look at the people waiting, and I try to read the room before the first case even starts. That morning I noticed a woman in the second row who looked exhausted. She had a child asleep on her lap, a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old. The child's head drooped against her mother's arm. The woman had dark circles under her eyes, and she was dressed in what I recognized immediately as scrubs. She was a nurse or some kind of medical worker, still in her uniform, probably coming directly from a night shift. I made a mental note. That's someone who deserves patience and consideration. I didn't know her case yet, but I made that note. The first few cases moved along. A young college student with 2 parking tickets who had an explanation about a broken parking meter, and I could see he was telling the truth. A retired gentleman with a speeding ticket who told me he was rushing to get his wife's prescription because the pharmacy was about to close. I dismissed that one without a second thought. His wife had been sick, he said. He got a little emotional when he mentioned her. I told him to give her my regards and drive carefully. Then I called the case of a man named Richard Holloway. I looked up from the file when he approached the bench. He was a well-dressed man, somewhere in his mid-50s, expensive suit, a gold watch that caught the light. He walked up to my bench with a kind of casual confidence that I've seen before. the kind of confidence that some people carry when they believe that money insulates them from inconvenience. He had a cell phone in his hand, and he glanced at it twice before he even reached the bench. I noticed that. I noticed everything. The charge was a parking violation. He had parked his car in a handicapped space outside a restaurant downtown. He didn't have a handicap placard. The ticket was $80. I asked him if he understood the charge. He smiled, not a warm smile, more of an impatient one, and he said, "Your Honor, I'll just pay the fine. I don't need to discuss this." I looked at him and I said, "Well, Mr. Holloway, I'd like to discuss it. Do you have a disability or a medical condition that would qualify you for a handicap parking permit?" He shifted his weight. He said no, but the lot was full, and I was only going to be 5 minutes. I said, "Sir, that space is reserved for people who need it, people who struggle to walk, people with physical limitations that most of us don't have to think about. You took that space from someone who might have genuinely needed it that day." He looked at me with barely concealed irritation, and he said, "With all due respect, Your Honor, it was 5 minutes." I took a breath. I said, "Mr. Holloway, I'm going to double your fine to $160, and I'm going to ask you to think, really think, about why that space exists and who it's for." He started to protest. I looked at him steadily, and I said, "Is there anything else you'd like to say?" There wasn't. He paid his fine and walked out, and as he passed the gallery, he glanced at the woman in the scrubs with a look that I can only describe as dismissive, like she was beneath his notice entirely. I saw that, and it stayed with me. We moved through several more cases after that. The woman in the scrubs turned out to be a home health aide named Rosa. She had a parking ticket from a neighborhood where she regularly visited an elderly patient. She told me the patient was bedridden and couldn't be left alone. She had run to move her car when the 2-hour limit was up, and she had been 4 minutes late getting back. 4 minutes. I looked at her sitting there in her uniform, with her little girl asleep against her shoulder, and I said, "Rosa, I'm dismissing this." She looked up at me with the most genuine gratitude I've seen in a long time. She said, "Thank you, Your Honor. God bless you." I told her to go home and get some sleep. She smiled, and I could see in that smile how tired she really was. Bone tired, the way you get when you're working to take care of others and not quite taking care of yourself. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever seen two different people walk into the same situation and show you everything you need to know about their character without saying a word? Richard Holloway in his expensive suit, glancing at his phone, irritated at a minor inconvenience, and Rosa in her scrubs, apologizing for 4 minutes when she'd been up all night caring for a stranger. Two people, same courtroom, completely different souls. Leave me a comment, because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button for me. It was around 10:30 in the morning when Christina called the next case. I heard her say the name Daniel Torres. I looked down at the file in front of me, and I felt my eyebrows rise slightly. There were 7 counts listed, 7 parking violations, all within a 3-month period, plus 1 citation for an expired motor vehicle inspection sticker. That's a substantial file for what appeared to be a young man. The total fines were close to $400. I looked up toward the back of the courtroom. I watched him walk in, and I want to describe what I saw, because first impressions matter to me, not in the way they matter to someone who judges people by their clothes or their car or their zip code. They matter to me because after 40 years of watching people walk into my courtroom, I've learned to read the way a person carries themselves. This young man was somewhere around 20, 21 years old. He was wearing a pair of dark work pants and a button-up shirt that he had clearly ironed himself because the creases were a little crooked, the kind of crease you get when someone is trying their best but doesn't quite have the trick of it. He had his hair combed neat. He was holding a manila envelope in both hands, pressed against his stomach, like it was something he was protecting. He walked up to the bench, and he looked at me directly, and he said, "Good morning, Your Honor." His voice was quiet, not timid, not scared, just quiet. There is a difference. Timid sounds like a person who's afraid. Quiet sounds like a person who is carrying something heavy and has learned to do it without making noise about it. I said, "Good morning." I looked at the file and I said, "Mr. Torres, I have 7 parking violations here and an expired inspection sticker. That's quite a few citations in a short period of time. Can you help me understand what's been going on?" He nodded. He looked at me for a moment and then he said, "Your Honor, I'm raising my little sister." I stopped. "I want to be honest with you. I have sat on this bench for 40 years. I have heard explanations for violations of every kind. I have heard stories that broke my heart, and stories that made me furious, and stories that I still think about decades later. But something about those 4 words, the quiet way he said them, the steadiness in his eyes, even though I could see something trembling just underneath the surface of all that composure, it stopped me completely. For a moment I couldn't speak. I just looked at him. And the courtroom, which is never fully quiet, seemed to go very still. I removed my glasses and I set them down on the bench, and I said to him, "Tell me about that." He took a slow breath. He said, "My parents were killed 14 months ago, a car accident on the interstate. It was November, there was ice, and a truck lost control. They were both gone." He said it plainly, the way you say something that you've had to say enough times, that you found the words that let you get through it without falling apart. My parents were killed. I heard the flatness of it, and I understood that the flatness was not coldness, it was survival. He said, "My sister Sophia is 9 years old. Our closest relatives are our grandparents on my mother's side, but they're in their late 70s, and my grandfather has serious heart problems. They couldn't take her. There was nobody else. I was a sophomore at University of Rhode Island. I was studying engineering. I left school and I came home to Providence. I got an apartment near Sophia's school. I got a job." I said to him, "What kind of job?" He said, "I work at a warehouse during the day, unloading and sorting. I start at 6 in the morning. I also deliver food in the evenings when Sophia is done with homework and I can settle her in. On weekends, I do maintenance work for a property management company." I said, "3 jobs." He said, "Yes, sir, sometimes 3. I picked my glasses back up and I put them on, and I looked at this young man standing in front of me. And I thought about my own children when they were young. I thought about what it would mean to have your whole life, your education, your plans, your future, just changed in a single moment on an icy road in November. And I thought about what kind of person makes the choice he made, because he had a choice. He could have let the system take Sophia. He could have let her go into foster care and finished his degree and tried to rebuild something for himself. Nobody could have blamed him for that. Nobody. He was 20 years old. He had every right to fall apart. But he didn't. I said, Mr. Torres, the parking violations, I'd like to understand each of them. He reached into his manila envelope, and I watched him carefully unfold several pieces of paper. He was organized. The papers were in order. He had written notes on them in small, neat handwriting. He said, 6 of the 7 tickets are from the same block, Jefferson Elementary School on Dexter Street. He said, Sophia gets out of school at 3:15. My warehouse shift doesn't end until 3. I have to drive straight from work. I park in the no parking zone on Dexter Street because the actual parking lot fills up fast and Sophia has asthma. When the weather is cold or she's been running during recess, sometimes she needs her inhaler. If I park 2 blocks away, she has to walk in the cold air, and last winter she had 2 attacks. I nodded slowly. I said, and the 7th ticket? He said, that one is from the parking lot of Rhode Island Hospital. Sophia had a respiratory episode in January, and I brought her to the emergency room at 11 at night. I didn't have the right change for the parking machine, and the machine wouldn't take my card. I was trying to get her inside fast. I got a $40 ticket. He folded his papers back carefully and put them back in the envelope. I said, tell me about the inspection sticker. He looked at me and said, the car needs a rear brake caliper replaced. It's about $320 for the part and labor. I've been saving toward it, but Sophia's asthma medication runs about $90 a month. Last month, one of her inhalers needed refilling earlier than expected, and I had to use what I'd saved. He paused. He said, I know I was supposed to get the inspection done. I've been driving as carefully as I can. I said, how long has the sticker been expired? He said, 4 months. I sat there for a moment. I looked at this young man with his carefully ironed shirt and his organized papers and his quiet voice. I thought about the arrogance of Richard Holloway that morning, standing there with his gold watch, annoyed at a minor inconvenience, dismissive of everyone around him. And here was this boy, 21 years old, working 3 jobs, raising a 9-year-old girl, managing medications and school pickups and emergency room visits, and apologizing to me for a parking ticket. I had to take my glasses off again. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't affected. I was. I said, Mr. Torres, how is Sophia doing in school? Something changed in his face when I asked that. Not dramatically, not a sudden smile or a burst of emotion. It was more subtle than that. It was the way a person's face changes when they get to talk about something they love. He said, she's doing really well, Your Honor. She loves reading. Her teacher says she's one of the strongest readers in her class. She wants to be a veterinarian. She has a list of animals she's going to treat. He said that last part with just the hint of a smile, and I recognized that smile. It was the smile of someone who is exhausted and stretched thin and still somehow genuinely delighted by the person they're caring for. I said, and how are you doing? He looked at me for a second like the question surprised him, like it hadn't occurred to him that anyone might think to ask. He said, "I'm okay, Your Honor. I'm managing." I said, "No, I mean really, how are you doing?" He looked down at the envelope in his hands for a moment. Then he looked back up at me and he said quietly, "Some days are hard. I miss school. I had a plan, for my life." But then he stopped himself and he said, "But Sophia is worth it. Every single day of it. She's worth it." I'm going to be honest with you. At that point, I was struggling to keep my composure. I've been on this bench a long time. I have built up what my wife affectionately calls my judge face, the ability to appear calm and neutral when what I'm feeling is anything but. But Daniel Torres was testing that. Something about his steadiness, his complete lack of self-pity, the way he just stated the facts of his impossible situation without drama or manipulation. It got to me deeply. If you've ever met someone who gives everything they have and then apologizes for not giving more, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next, I never saw coming in my entire career. I was about to speak. I have made my decision. I was going to dismiss every single charge, every fine, all $400 of it, because justice is not just about enforcing the letter of the law. Justice is about understanding the spirit of the law. And the spirit of the law is never served by punishing a 21-year-old boy for parking in a restricted zone while he was trying to make sure his asthmatic little sister didn't have a breathing attack on a cold sidewalk. But before I could say a word, I heard a sound from the gallery. I looked up. A woman I had not noticed before was standing up in the third row. She was a small woman, maybe 50 or so, with a teacher's kind of bearing, the way some people carry an absolute natural authority about them without having to demand anything from the room. She was holding something in her hand, and she looked at me and said, "Your Honor, I'm sorry for the interruption. My name is Patricia Chen. I'm Sophia Torres' third grade teacher at Jefferson Elementary." She said, "I came here today because I wanted the court to know something about this young man." I looked at her. I said, "Go ahead, Miss Chen." She said, "I've been a teacher for 22 years. I have seen children in difficult situations. I have worked with families going through all kinds of hardship. But I have never seen anything like what Daniel does for Sophia." She paused. She said, "Every morning, without exception, Sophia arrives at school on time. Her homework is always done. She's clean and well-dressed, and she's had breakfast. She participates in class. She laughs. She is, and I want you to hear this, she is a happy child. After losing both her parents 14 months ago, Sophia Torres is a happy child. And that is entirely because of her brother." She held up the thing she had been holding. It was a piece of paper, children's drawing paper, the kind with the slightly rough texture. I could see from the bench that it was a drawing, done in crayon, the vivid, earnest kind of drawing that 9-year-olds produce when they're drawing something they care about deeply. Miss Chen said, "Sophia made this last week. I asked my class to draw their hero." She said, "Sophia drew Daniel." I could see across the courtroom that the figure in the drawing was a young man in work pants with a big smile and the words "My Hero" written in large, wobbly, confident letters across the top. Time seemed to stop. I am not exaggerating when I tell you that. I have said that expression, "time seemed to stop," 100 times in my life, and usually I mean it loosely. But in that moment, truly, everything went still. The courtroom, the noise of the building around us, everything. I sat there looking at that drawing from across the room, and I could not speak. Daniel was looking at the drawing too, and I watched his jaw tighten, the way jaws do when someone is fighting very hard not to cry. His hands were completely steady on the envelope, but his jaw was tight and his eyes were bright. I took a very long, very slow breath. I said, "Miss Chen, I need you to bring that drawing up here, please." She walked it up to my bench and she handed it to me. I looked at it. Sophia had drawn Daniel in his work clothes. She'd given him a cape, the kind of cape you give a superhero. And in the corner of the drawing, very small, she had drawn herself next to him, her hand in his, and both of them were smiling. Under the drawing, in the uneven handwriting of a 9-year-old who is trying very hard to write neatly, it said, "Daniel is my brother and my daddy and my best friend." I had to set that drawing down. I took my glasses off and I pressed my fingers against my eyes for a moment. And I am not ashamed to tell you that I was holding back tears. I'm a 73-year-old man who has been a judge for 40 years, and I was holding back tears in front of a full courtroom. My father used to say, "A man who cannot be moved by genuine love is a man who has stopped being human." I thought about that. I thought about my father walking off that boat with nothing. And I thought about this 21-year-old young man who had the whole rest of his life in front of him and chose, without hesitation, to come home and be his little sister's world. I put my glasses back on. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at me steadily. He was still holding himself very carefully together. I said, "Mr. Torres, do you know your sister drew that picture of you?" He shook his head slightly. He said, "No, Your Honor. I didn't know she did that." I said, "Your teacher says she drew it when asked to draw her hero." He pressed his lips together. He nodded once, small and tight. I looked out at the courtroom. I looked at all the people sitting there, the ones waiting for their cases to be called, a few members of the public who had come in to watch proceedings, Christina at her desk. Every single person in that room was watching Daniel Torres, and the room was completely silent. I want to tell you something I've learned after 40 years on this bench. The law is a powerful thing. It is the framework on which a just society is built. But the law is not separate from humanity. It is an expression of humanity. It is our collective attempt, imperfect as we are, to say that there are standards of decency and fairness that we hold ourselves to. And when I am in the presence of someone who embodies those standards, not because the law demands it, but because their character demands it, then I have a responsibility to recognize that. Before I tell you what I did next, let me ask you this. Do you think wealth should protect someone from consequences? Should money or status put someone above the law? And on the other side of that, should a young man who gives up his entire future to care for his little sister be burdened with hundreds of dollars in fines that he scraped together 3 jobs to barely survive? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe everyone should be equal under the law like I do, hit that subscribe button. I looked down at Daniel's file. I looked at every single charge. 7 parking violations, one expired inspection sticker. I thought about Richard Holloway that morning with his gold watch, and his impatience, and his dismissal of the rules that exist to protect the most vulnerable. And I thought about this young man in his carefully ironed shirt, parking in a restricted zone so his sister wouldn't have a breathing attack. I said, "Mr. Torres, I'm going to do something this morning that I hope stays with you for the rest of your life. I'm dismissing every charge on this file, every single one. No fines, no fees, nothing." I heard the gallery react. A quiet murmur, the sound a crowd makes when something surprises them, something that feels right. I said, "But I want to say something to you first." I leaned forward. I wanted him to hear this clearly. I said, "Daniel, what you are doing for your sister is one of the most remarkable things I have witnessed in my 40 years on this bench. Not because it's perfect, because it isn't. You have unpaid parking tickets and an expired inspection sticker, and I imagine there are 100 other things that aren't perfect right now. But what makes what you're doing remarkable is that you chose it. You chose Sophia. When your life fell apart, when you had every right and every reason to walk away, you came home. You put on those work pants and you got to the warehouse at 6 a.m, and you picked her up from school, and you made sure her inhaler was full, and you ironed your shirt to come stand before me today, and you did all of it without complaint and without self-pity. I paused. I said, "Your father and mother raised you well. I know you probably don't hear that enough, but they raised you well, Daniel." He couldn't hold it anymore after that. His eyes filled with tears, and one of them broke loose and ran down his face, and he let it go. He didn't raise his hand to wipe it away. He just stood there and let it run, and he nodded at me, just nodded. And that nod said everything. I said, "Case dismissed, all counts." I set the gavel down and I said, "God bless you, son." The courtroom erupted, not in a wild, chaotic way, more like a room exhaling a breath it had been holding. There was applause, not the kind you hear at a show, but the kind you hear when people are moved, when they feel something true has just happened in front of them. I heard the applause, and I let it go on for a moment longer than I normally would. Because that applause wasn't for me, it was for Daniel Torres. It was for a 21-year-old boy raising his little sister. And it was right and good that a room full of strangers was clapping for him. Then something happened that I did not plan for and did not expect. A man in the gallery stood up. I looked at him. He was a heavy-set man in his early 60s, wearing a plain sweater, no fancy suit, no gold watch. Just a regular man, the kind of man who could be your neighbor or your uncle. He said, "Your Honor, I'm sorry. Can I say something?" I looked at him and I said, "Go ahead." He said, "My name is Robert Marcello. I own a construction and property management company here in Providence." He said, "I've been sitting back here this morning for my own case, which I assume is later on, and I've been listening to this young man." He looked at Daniel. He said, "Son, if you want a job, a real job, with real pay and benefits and a real schedule, you call my office." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, and he held it up. He said, "I need people who work hard and who have character. You've got both. The pay starts at $22 an hour, and there's a health insurance plan." Daniel stared at him. He didn't seem to know what to say for a moment. Then he said, Thank you, sir. Christina was dabbing at her eyes. I pretended not to notice that, because I was also trying very hard to maintain my composure. And if we looked at each other, we were both going to lose it completely. I cleared my throat. I said, Mr. Marcello, for the record, that was a very decent thing to do. He shrugged and sat back down and said, I just called it like I saw it, Your Honor. I want you to understand what I felt in that moment. After 40 years, I have seen a lot of darkness walk through these doors. I have seen cruelty and dishonesty and contempt. I have seen people lie to my face and manipulate the system and disrespect everything this courtroom stands for. And then I have seen moments like this one, when the goodness in people rises up without being asked, when a stranger stands up for a stranger, when a room full of people who came here with their own problems and their own stress stop thinking about themselves for a minute and feel something genuine together. This is exactly why I still put on these robes every morning after 40 years, for moments like these, when justice actually works the way it's supposed to, when the law and compassion and humanity line up perfectly and something true happens. If that means something to you, if you believe in that, show me by hitting that like button and subscribing. Let me know I'm not alone in believing this stuff matters. I held court for the rest of that morning, but I want to tell you honestly, I was somewhere else. Physically, I was there, calling cases, listening, ruling. But in my mind, I kept coming back to Daniel Torres and that drawing, that crayon cape, those wobbly letters. Daniel is my brother and my daddy and my best friend. I've seen a lot of things in this life. That drawing went on a list of things I will carry with me forever. I was back in my chambers just after noon, eating the sandwich Christina always brings me on Tuesdays, when she knocked on my door and opened it and said, Judge, there's a woman out here who'd like to speak with you if you have a moment. I looked up. She said, It's Miss Chen, Sophia's teacher. I said, Send her in. Patricia Chen sat across from me in the chair on the other side of my desk. She was carrying a large paper shopping bag, and she set it on the floor carefully. I said, Miss Chen, thank you for what you did this morning. She shook her head and said, I couldn't not come. She said, Judge Caprio, I've been Sophia's teacher since September. She came to me in September, 30 days after her parents died. She said, I want you to know what I saw on the first day Sophia came into my classroom. She said, I had been told about the family situation. The social worker had called the school. I was prepared for a child who was withdrawn or acting out or struggling to function. She said Sophia walked into my classroom with her backpack on both shoulders, very neatly dressed, and she sat down in her seat and she took out her notebook and she was ready. She said she looked at me and said, Good morning. She was 9 years old. She had just lost both her parents, and she said, Good morning. Patricia Chen looked at me. She said, That kind of resilience doesn't come from nowhere, Judge. It comes from feeling safe. It comes from having someone who holds the world together for you, even when everything has fallen apart. She said, That's what Daniel does for her, every day. I sat with that for a moment. I said, How is Daniel managing from what you can see? She thought about it. She said, He shows up. He's at every school event he possibly can be. The fall parent-teacher conferences, he sat across from me for 30 minutes and asked questions about Sophia's reading level and her social development and whether she was making friends. She said, "He was so tired I thought he might fall asleep in the chair, but he asked every question. He took notes." She paused and then she said, "He's doing something remarkable, but he's doing it alone, and he's running on empty." I picked up the manila envelope that Daniel had left with me. Christina had set it on my desk after court. I opened it and looked at the organized papers inside, the notes in neat, small handwriting. I thought about a 21-year-old engineering student sitting in an apartment in Providence at 11 o'clock at night, making notes about parking tickets, organizing his papers, ironing his shirt for a court appearance, getting his documentation in order. I thought about how much energy and self-discipline that takes when you're exhausted and grieving and working 3 jobs. I thought about how most 21-year-olds I know could barely keep track of a homework assignment. I reached into the bag Miss Chen had brought. She said, "Some of the parents at the school found out about this morning." She said, "I made a few calls last night after I decided to come." She said, "The community pulled some things together." Inside the bag were envelopes, gift cards, cash, a note from the parents of Sophia's classmates. There was a handwritten card signed by what looked like about 30 different families. It said, "To Daniel and Sophia, you are not alone. Providence loves you." There was money in that bag that totaled, when Christina counted it later that afternoon, over $2,000. I've been in this chair a long time. I have seen Providence show up for its people before. This city has a big heart. But I am going to be honest with you. I had to blow my nose twice that afternoon, and I made absolutely sure that Christina was not in the room when I did it. Now, I told you there was more to this story, and I meant it. About 3 weeks after that Tuesday, I received an envelope in the mail at my chambers. It had a Providence return address. The handwriting on the outside was careful, deliberate, the kind of handwriting you use when you want to get something exactly right. I opened it, and inside was a letter. And then, tucked behind the letter, was another piece of paper, a drawing. The drawing was in crayon again. It showed my courtroom, or at least a 9-year-old's interpretation of my courtroom, which had an enormous wooden desk and a tiny stick figure with glasses and a robe behind it. In front of the stick figure judge were 2 other stick figures, a tall one holding the hand of a small one. Both of them were smiling enormous smiles. And at the top, in those same uneven, earnest letters, it said, "Thank you for seeing us." I put that drawing in a frame. It is on the wall of my chambers. It has been there ever since, and it is going to stay there. The letter was from Daniel. I'm going to read you parts of it because I believe these words deserve to be heard. He wrote, "Dear Judge Caprio, I don't know how to write a letter that says what I'm feeling because I don't think there are words for it. I have spent 14 months trying to be strong enough for Sophia. I've been trying to be strong enough that she doesn't see me fall apart, strong enough that she still feels like she has a home and a family, strong enough that she can be a regular little girl and laugh at funny things and believe the world is going to be okay for her. I've been so focused on being strong that I forgot that sometimes you need someone to see you. And you saw me, Your Honor. You really saw me. And I don't know why that mattered so much, but it did. It mattered more than I can say." He wrote, "I called Mr. Marcello. I start work with his company in 2 weeks. The pay is more than I've made at all 3 of my jobs combined. I'll be able to stop the delivery driving and the weekend maintenance work. I'll be home with Sophia in the evenings. He wrote, "She doesn't know yet. I'm going to tell her on Saturday morning over breakfast. That's our special time. Saturday morning I make her pancakes, and she tells me everything she's been thinking about all week. I'm going to tell her over pancakes that things are going to be a little easier from here." He wrote, "I think she's going to cry, and I think I am too, and that's okay. My parents used to say that tears at a breakfast table are just love finding its way out. I think they were right." I had to put that letter down for a moment. I thought about my own father. I thought about him at the kitchen table, teaching me about the law, about equality, about the dignity that every human being deserves. I thought about what he would have said if he could have read that letter. I think he would have said, "Frank, this is why it matters. This right here. Not the cases, not the statistics, not the precedents. This. A boy raising his little sister and calling it love." About 2 months after that, I was sitting at my desk early on a Tuesday morning, going through case files with my coffee, when Christina knocked on the door and opened it and said, "Judge, there's someone here to see you." She said, "It's Daniel Torres, and with him is his sister." I looked up. I said, "Well, send them in." The door opened and Daniel walked in. He was wearing different clothes than the last time I'd seen him. He was still in work clothes, but he looked different. He looked rested. Not completely. I suspect Daniel Torres hasn't been fully rested in over a year and won't be for some time. But there was a lightness in him that hadn't been there before. And holding his hand was Sophia. She was small. She had big dark eyes and dark hair pulled back in 2 braids, and she was wearing a bright blue coat. She looked around my chambers with the alert, absorbing gaze of a child who was genuinely interested in everything. Her eyes landed on the drawing on my wall, and she stared at it. Then she looked at me. She said, "That's my drawing." I said, "It is. I put it in a frame because it belongs on a wall where people can see it." She thought about that very seriously for a moment. Then she nodded as if I had confirmed something she had suspected. She said, "I put a cape on him because he is actually a superhero." I laughed. I looked at Daniel and he was smiling, the full, unguarded smile of someone who is, in this moment, happy. I said, "Sophia, I think you're completely right about that." She walked over to the drawing on the wall, and she stood on her toes and she looked at it closely for a long time. Then she turned around and she looked at her brother and she said, "Do you have a cape?" He said, "I'm saving up for one." She nodded solemnly. She said, "I'll make you one." I want to tell you what I felt watching those two, because I think this is the heart of everything I've spent 40 years trying to understand. Daniel Torres came into my courtroom with nothing to offer except the truth. He didn't have money or influence or a lawyer in a suit. He had the truth. He had his organized papers and his iron shirt and his quiet voice and the honest story of what his life looked like since the ice on an interstate highway changed everything. And the law, when it functions the way it's supposed to function, when it's wielded by people who understand what it's truly for, has the ability to see that, to see the truth and respond to it with justice. Not just the technical application of rules, but real justice, human justice, the kind that leaves a room full of strangers feeling like the world is a little more right than it was an hour ago. I thought about something I said to a young law student years ago, back when I was still doing lectures at Providence College. I said, if you go into law thinking it's about the rules, you'll be a mediocre lawyer. If you go into it thinking it's about the people, you might be a great one. The rules are the tools. The people are the reason. I think about Daniel Torres every time I hear cynicism about justice. Every time someone tells me the system is broken beyond repair. Every time someone says the law only works for the powerful. I think about a 21-year-old in work pants with a manila envelope and a quiet voice and 4 words that stop me cold. I'm raising my little sister. I think about a room full of strangers clapping for him. I think about Robert Marcello standing up with a business card. I think about 30 families who had never met Daniel putting money together because they heard his story and they felt something. I think about the drawing on my wall. Thank you for seeing us. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too lenient, or was that exactly the right thing to do? I'm genuinely curious what you think, because I've had people tell me, Judge Caprio, you can't just dismiss fines because someone has a sad story. And I understand that perspective, I do. The law has to have consistency. Rules have to mean something or they mean nothing. But here's what I would say back. Consistency doesn't mean treating every situation identically. It means applying the same values to every situation. And the values that matter to me are fairness, proportion, and humanity. There was nothing disproportionate about what Daniel Torres was doing when he got those tickets. There was nothing lacking in character or judgment. There was a young man making impossible choices under impossible circumstances and getting it right. The fine didn't serve justice. Dismissing it did. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. The comments from people watching these stories are one of the things that keeps me going. You remind me that the values I believe in, fairness, decency, the equality of all people before the law, you remind me that these values are shared, that I'm not the only one who believes they matter. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom, because I have more of these. I've been storing them up for 40 years and they are worth telling. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who might be carrying something heavy right now and needs to be reminded that there are still people who will see them. That's what the law is for. At its best, not to crush people, but to see them, to look at the full picture of who they are and what they're dealing with, and respond with fairness. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'll leave you with this. About 8 months after that Tuesday, I was walking out of the courthouse on a Friday afternoon, and I ran into Patricia Chen, Sophia's teacher, in the parking lot. She recognized me, and she stopped me and she said, "Judge Caprio, I have an update for you." She said, "Sophia won the school district's Young Author Award." She wrote a story for the competition. The topic was, anyone can write about. Just tell a true story that matters to you. She said, Sophia wrote a story about her brother. It was 12 pages long. The judges said it was the most honest, most beautiful piece of writing they'd seen from a child in the competition in 10 years. She showed me a photograph on her phone. It was Sophia standing at a podium in what looked like a school auditorium, holding a blue ribbon, smiling the smile of someone who knows they have done something real. And standing in the audience, visible in the background, was Daniel. He was clapping. And even in a small photograph on a phone screen, even from a distance, I could see that he was crying. The happy kind. The kind my parents called love finding its way out. That's what justice looks like to me. Not just the moment the gavel comes down, but what happens next. How people carry it forward. How a boy and a girl keep building their life together. How a room full of strangers chooses to be decent. How a city decides to show up. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law. Every single one of us. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless, wearing a gold watch or wearing work pants ironed with crooked creases by someone trying their best. That's what makes this country work. That's what my father believed when he stepped off that boat with nothing but hope. And that's what I've spent every day of my career trying to honor. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you. And remember, respect costs nothing, but it is worth everything.